Hi everyone! Today we're going to talk about the birth, or perhaps rebirth, of linear perspective. So before linear perspective, artists created a sense of depth in their picture planes, but it wasn't always a believable space. They, of course, used the techniques that we've already discussed to create that illusion of depth. Things like vertical location, scale, and overlap. However, you'll notice in these examples from the 14th century, the space isn't completely a believable space, and the relationships between the different planes in the space don't quite make sense. The tabletop here and the bed down here both seem to be tipping forward. This was a common thing that happened in paintings that you see from the 14th and 15th centuries, where they don't appear to be parallel to the floor. So the relationship between parallel planes, parallel lines, and perpendicular planes or perpendicular lines weren't always believable. This is, of course, because the artists weren't using linear perspective. So what is linear perspective? To go over it quickly, the basic idea of linear perspective is that parallel lines that go alongside each other, that are equal distance to each other, but that never meet, like two rails of a railroad track, appear to converge in the distance at the horizon line. So we know that the lines are truly parallel, but visually they have an illusion that they converge. These converging lines are called the orthogonals, and they meet at the vanishing point, which happens to be on the horizon line. In one-point perspective, which is the simplest of linear perspective, the object, in this case a simple box, is facing the viewer so that this entire plane, the frontal plane of the box, is facing us. And all of the lines that are going away from us, in this case the four edges of the box, those lines appear to converge at the vanishing point, again, which is on the horizon line. So diagonal lines here called orthogonals. Orthogonals converge at the vanishing point, which is on the horizon line. In two-point perspective, the idea is the same. However, notice that now this simple box has been turned so that instead of seeing the frontal plane of the box, we're seeing the edge or corner of the box. This means that both planes, both sides of the box, are going away from us. So these two sides of the box are perpendicular to each other, right? They come together at a right angle, and they are both going away from us. So the lines that are parallel, such as this top line and this bottom line, go to one vanishing point. Anything that is parallel with these two lines is going to go to that vanishing point. Anything that's parallel with these two lines is going to go to a second vanishing point. Notice that these vanishing points are still on the horizon line. So during the early Renaissance and then into the height of the Renaissance, artists started to figure out this concept of converging lines or orthogonals. One of the first uses of perspective was in Giotto's Jesus Before the Knife in 1305. This was more than 100 years before Brunelleschi, who we'll talk about in just a moment. And you'll notice that here Giotto has started to get this concept of parallel lines converging. Okay, they're converging at a point. However, where he goes wrong is he does not have a consistent vanishing point for all parallel lines. So we have some lines going to a vanishing point, some lines going to a different vanishing point, other lines just kind of going off to nowhere. So we start to get this illusion of a real space. The ceiling here is looking pretty good, but then other parts of the composition, like the stairs, still aren't quite making sense. So here comes Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi was born in 1377, died in 1446. True Renaissance man. We hear that term, expression, Renaissance man. That really was what Brunelleschi was. He was a sculptor. He was an architect. He was an engineer. He kind of did it all, right? And he's the one that's given credit for the invention of linear perspective. Here's a sculpture of Brunelleschi looking up at the famous dome that he built for the Duomo in Florence. And he also built San Lorenzo and many other very famous structures. No written record exists from Brunelleschi's experiments. It's expected that he passed along his knowledge and his ideas verbally to other artists such as Masaccio, Masolino, Donatello, who all began to incorporate these concepts in their works and pass it on to their students. In 1423, which is still a decade or more after Brunelleschi's reported discovery of perspective, famous painters were still confused by this concept of linear perspective, or perhaps unaware of the concept of linear perspective. So it shows you just how slowly this really was brought into everyday practice in art. Obviously, information was spread much more slowly back then. People weren't posting YouTube videos or Instagram posts, so it took a long time for the ideas and the techniques of linear perspective to become widely used. This is a famous painter, Fabriano, and it shows a complete lack of awareness of that idea of one-point perspective. So we have illusion of depth, which is effective. You know, he creates that. Using scale and having lines that seem to recede into space. But when we look at the actual orthogonals that he's using, which have been laid out here with these white lines, you'll notice that they all fail to converge on any single vanishing point. All right. Throughout the 15th century, the new tool of linear perspective was beginning to be employed by artists, and they were quite enthusiastic about this idea of making their compositions, their illusions, much more realistic as part of their visual storytelling. One of the very first known uses of accurate central convergence was by Masolino in 1425. This is a picture that shows actually two separate stories at once. There's a story happening here on the left and another one here on the right. The healing of the cripple and the raising of Tabitha. And you'll notice, if we look at it with lines drawn on top here, you'll notice that all of the architectural orthogonals or parallel lines all do converge at the same point, which is the vanishing point. Furthermore, you'll notice that the vanishing point is at the same level as the eyesight of the standing figures. This is important because a big part of linear perspective is that the horizon line represents the eye level of either the people that are in the composition and sometimes the viewer as well. So this idea that the horizon line, even though we don't see a physical line being drawn in there, because there's of course buildings blocking where the horizon line would be, we see that the vanishing point is on the horizon line and that the horizon line is in fact in line with the eyesight of the people, the standing figures. This is a relief sculpture by Donatello from 1425, and this panel is widely recognized as the first relief sculpture to use linear perspective. It's quite hard to see it in this image, but you can see that there's an architectural element. There's a table here, and there's quite a bit of architecture back here. And that table, there's also tiles on the floor here. So all of these elements do also use that, or use those orthogonals and vanishing point. This is Masaccio, 1427. Masaccio's Trinity is usually considered to be the oldest surviving perspective painting. Masaccio is said to have consulted with Brunelleschi on this painting. He used grid framework tooled right into the surface in a very rigorous linear perspective. Even the nails in this painting are drawn in using linear perspective. So very large painting. This is fresco. That's why it says that he tooled right into the surface. So this is painted on a wet plaster on a wall, which was a very common way to create paintings, murals during the Renaissance. So he actually was able to tool or mark right into that wet plaster to help him see where all of these lines would go. And what makes this painting particularly impressive is that the horizon line in this painting actually matches with the horizon line or the eye level of the viewer. So the viewpoint of the painting is very, very low, meaning for most of the painting it appears as though you're looking up, right? That's because on the wall where this is painted, this figure here represents the average height of a person, and you can see where their eye level would be. So anything depicted below eye level looks as though you're looking down on it. Anything that's depicted above that horizon line or eye level looks as though you're looking up at it. So it really begins to kind of trick the viewer into feeling like it really is a believable space. If this were a true architectural space within the church, this is how you would see it. This is how you would view it. It's how it would look like to you. And he was able to achieve that illusion by using linear perspective and placing the horizon line at the line of sight of the average viewer. So after the Renaissance, linear perspective was alive and well, and used and employed by many artists until the end of the 19th century. And here you can see artist styles obviously changed dramatically, subject matter changed, painting style changed, art materials changed. But linear perspective continued to be taught and continued to be used widely in painting. And then came the 20th century. And for those of you who have taken art appreciation or who have taken art history, you know that with the 20th century, a lot of art movements came in. The Cubists, the Futurists, Constructivism, Dadaists, Minimalists, and they said, "This is not a window, stupid. It's a piece of canvas. We put paint on it. Treat it like a piece of canvas. Treat it like paint. Don't try to create these illusions that aren't real." So the idea of creating a realistic window became moot, became unimportant to many of these artists. And you have artists here like Pablo Picasso or Boccioni, who are totally disregarding that idea of creating realistic sense of space. And in fact, in some ways, some of these Cubist paintings of Picasso feel a little bit like those 14th century paintings where they weren't quite getting the planes right and things felt skewed. But of course here, Pablo Picasso is doing it on purpose, not because he doesn't know how to use linear perspective. This is considered the birth of the integrity of the picture plane, and many artists, starting from the 20th century and into today, decided that pictures should be flat, or even if they're not flat, that they shouldn't necessarily be a realistic representation of the outside world, and linear perspective was dead. But fear not, that was at least just for the avant-garde. And while many artists today don't use linear perspective in their work, there are still plenty that do. And here are just three images by three different contemporary artists living and working and exhibiting in Los Angeles today that use linear perspective very effectively and very beautifully in their work.